I am Dr. Melissa Omino, and I am the director of CIPIT, which is a Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law at Strathmore University. We are a research center that sits in between academia and being a policy think tank. What does that mean? We produce evidence-based research in the areas of artificial intelligence, data governance, intellectual property, and ICT law and policy. And my passion project, which is what I'm going to speak to you about today, lies in the intersection of all these things. My presentation is not going to be a technical presentation. It's not really about data governance frameworks as you know them. This is going to be a story about people. And it's going to be about communities and cultures and languages that exist before any data set is created, and about what makes it, or what it means to govern data when those human realities are the starting point. So when we talk about data governance, we almost always start with the data set. But what if the story begins before the data is actually collected? Data governance has historically been about what happens after the data exists. Who stores it? Where is it stored? Who processes it? Who profits from it? Who regulates it? And all these are important upstream questions. But today I'm asking you to think about the downstream questions. Who holds the knowledge? What is carried in the data set? And who gets to decide whether that knowledge becomes data in the first place? Governance that starts when the data set is already compiled has already missed the mark. So what problem am I discussing? African languages are increasingly treated as extractable resources for AI training. In fact, a lot of AI researchers are currently, and have been doing so since about 2022, collecting African language data sets. We have large technology companies and well-resourced research labs collecting speech data, text data, and even translations. And they use them to train models that generate enormous commercial value. We heard yesterday about having AI that speaks to the people on the continent. And the only way that can be done is if the AI speaks the language. And the only way to get AI to speak the language is to have African language data sets. It sounds like a good thing, right? It means we are increasing the amount of African language data sets. But I want to ask you, is there uniform openness and are there equal outcomes with the collection of these language data sets, and who has access to them and who is benefiting from them? Most of these data sets are shared under standard public open licenses like the Creative Commons or the Community Data License Agreement that treats all users the same. Whether you're from the global north or the global minority, whether you're from the global majority, whether you're the speaker of the language, or you're just somebody building a tool elsewhere, you all have the same rights under a standard open license. And this sounds fair in theory, but in practice, it ignores vast asymmetries in infrastructure, capacity, and economic power. Communities are often left behind. What I like to call the language data communities are rarely consulted in meaningful ways. And consent, where it exists, often is thin and transactional. It's not informed and it is not an ongoing process. And benefit sharing, that rarely, if ever, happens. But despite this problem, Africa is not sitting by and waiting. There are actually governance frameworks that have been designed. These include the AU Continental AI Strategy that was endorsed by all 55 AU member states at the 45th Ordinary Session in Accra. And it's the first time that Africa was speaking with one voice around artificial intelligence. Okay, I think we're back. I must have said something wrong. An ancestor is listening to me. I will repeat and say, it's the first time Africa appeared to be speaking with one voice. We also have the Kenya National AI Strategy of 2025 to 2030. And this was launched in March of last year, where it's built around 6 pillars: infrastructure, data, talent, governance, investment, and ethics and inclusion. It emphasizes data and AI sovereignty, and it positions Kenya not only as a consumer, but also as a producer of AI. So, the point here was not to catalog every AI framework that exists on the continent, but it's to show you that policy architecture exists. The question is this enough? So what is the governance gap? Frameworks tell us what to govern, but communities tell us why it matters. And it's been interesting because, as you might know, Kenya is developing its national data governance policy. And in doing that, there are a lot of technical conversations. There are a lot of questions as to what is data governance and how data governance goes beyond data protection. I have heard quite a number of conversations of non-personal data versus personal data and what that means. But when you go to the communities, they are less interested in standards. They're less interested in cross-border data flows. And they're more interested with the data that comes close to home in terms of how are they represented in a data set? How will what they have contributed into data sets be used? So, the question is not that these policies and strategies are not required. They are necessary, but they are insufficient. They create the scaffolding, but governance that works must be filled with something else, and that is the lived experience, the cultural knowledge, and the collective agency of the communities whose data is at stake. And that's why I'm picking language as the use case. And this is where I get to now just talk about stories. CIPIT worked with Maseno Center of Applied AI at Maseno University, specifically Dr. Lillian Wanzare and her team, on a particular data set that they were collecting known as the Donam data set, which is basically language of the people of the lake. And that's about the Luo language. Now, in creating this data set, they had funding from Mozilla as well as the Fair Forward GIZ program. And they had the community where they would go and collect the language data. And the difference with this data set is that Dr. Leland Wanzari had heard myself and Sipitas talking about putting the community first when creating language data sets. And they asked us to go to Maseno University and take them through the process of centering the community when they are collecting language data. And so we went there and took them through what intellectual property is, because that's where you start from. What is intellectual property? What is a patent? What is copyright? What is trademark? This data set, what does it mean? What is an open license? Why do open licenses exist? What are the functions of open licenses? And then we told them about the Noodle license. Finally, after going through several sessions with the data community we describe those as the students and the research fellows at Maseno University who are cleaning up the data, and the language community, which are the actual language speakers who are contributing their voice and their words and text into the data set, they decided to land on the Noodle license as what would be licensing the Donam dataset. And I promise you it was not rigged. There are videos, and there's a whole article that will come out from Maseno University explaining the process. So what is the Noodle license? How many of you have heard about Noodle? Really? Okay. So Noodle stands for Nulite Obodo Open Data License. Nulite Obodo is an Igbo word that means building or raising the community. This license was developed by myself and Professor Chijioke Okore from the University of Pretoria. Thank you. Thanks. And it emerges from years of conversation with AI developers around language data sets and the ability to access these language data sets. For me personally, it starts from the JW300 dataset, which was a dataset that the Masahane Collective collected from the translation of the Bible from the Jehovah's Witness website. Now, it was the Bible translated into several African languages, and usually in the beginning of the natural language processing research area in Africa, a lot of the researchers would go online and what we call text data mine. So they would collect all the African languages that they could find online. And this translation of the Bible by the Jehovah's Witness really provided them a vast number of African languages that they could collect into a data set. But guess what? They were told by the Jehovah's Witness, okay, not by the Jehovah's Witness, they were told by CPIT that the Jehovah's Witness had a copyright license that prohibited text data mining. So it meant that they could not use that data set. The question that those researchers asked me is, but who owns African languages? How is it that these are our mother tongues and we cannot use this data? And I said proudly, that is the function of intellectual property law. A translation is a copyright. And unless the owner of the translation or the person who made the translation possible gives you permission to use it, you cannot use it, even when it is your mother tongue. But the question is, do you think the Jehovah's Witness, who are actually incorporated in the United States of America, were speaking those languages? Who do you think assisted them in creating the translations? Africans. And now Africans could not access the data set for technology use. That's why we came up with Noodle. Because after that JW300 dataset story, African researchers decided to collect their own data sets, right? So no longer conducting text data mining, but going into the community and sitting with the community and saying, okay, let's have a conversation. That is speech data collected. Or speaking with linguists and translating certain sentences into African sentences in order to create Africa datasets. This is obviously a very expensive process. It's expensive. So they needed funding to do it. And they were funded to do it. And with funding comes terms and conditions. And the terms and the conditions of the funding were that all those data sets must be released under open licenses. And with open licenses, it means everybody has access, including Jehovah's Witness. That is why I'm asking. Open and equal, is that true? So we came up with Noodle, and Noodle essentially is, if you can go to the next slide, that's the slide that was before the next one. Thank you. Noodle is a tiered approach. It is an open license, but we have distinguished the nature of openness, if I can say that, according to the jurisdiction that you're from. So, if you are an African developer, you have access to this license as though it was a Creative Commons license, a Creative Commons CC0 license, which means you can use it to do anything and everything you would like to do. If you are from a developing country, then you do have access to the data set, but you must share the results of that data set in the same way that this has been shared to you, okay? And it is restricted to those countries that are defined as developing nations. Now, the only people who have taken the leap in defining what a developing nation is the World Bank. It's important that you underscore that. Next is for developed countries. Here, we say that actually you must pay something to the community. A royalty, a benefit, something must be done. We do not explicitly define what the benefit is in the license, because if we did that, we would be doing exactly what the funders have been doing to the community. We want the community to have agency and to decide how they're going to share their data. So, a lot of people have had an issue with Noodle. They say it's protectionist. It goes against the principles of open licenses. Some of the interesting criticisms I've heard is that China is also a developing country. And therefore China will have access to the language data sets. I don't know what the problem with that is, because China has shared its modules with us, right? China is the only country that has shared algorithms openly. Also, I don't think China is utilizing African language data sets in a way that is detrimental for the language communities. But a question I will ask you, the current GPT that you're using, or LLM that you're using, does it speak to you in your language? Are you sure? If you have a conversation with ChatGPT in Kiswahili, will it respond in Kiswahili? Where did it get the data set from? Is ChatGPT always free? Is it free? You pay for it. Okay, I think I've made my point. Now, Noodle has been adopted not only by the Dhonam community, not only by Maseno, but also by the Mafoko project in South Africa, which is on multilingual terminologies for South African languages, and it shows that Noodle can work beyond the original NLP context. So what exactly does Noodle do? Next slide. It shows you that the philosophical and ethical foundation of this governance framework is the community. In Western data governance, the unit of governance is usually the individual. Individual consent, individual rights, individual data subjects. In an African framing grounded in Ubuntu or Ujamaa, depending on which one you want to use, governance is relational. I am because we are. And this means that data governance must account for collective interests and communal relationships, and not just individual transactions. So the other question around Noodle is, who is the community? Who is the community? That's what people say, especially those from the global north. We don't know who the community is. How are we going to identify the community? Oh my God. Also, what is this benefit? The license has not defined the benefit, therefore this is not a contractual instrument that makes sense in the Western context. What Noodle does is it sends you back to the community to negotiate with them. And the community decides which individual you negotiate with, because we don't expect you to negotiate with the whole Luo language speaking community. We are spread across Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. But the data set was collected from specific people. And those specific people in that particular instance are the community. The benefit will be defined by those specific set of people because it is their cultural knowledge that is infused in that language data set. That is relational ethics, collective agreement, collective negotiation through a representative. Next, we are saying that it is not charity, it is reciprocity that is required. And language data is not decontextualized training material. It carries oral histories, proverbs, cosmologies, ways of knowing. You cannot strip language of its cultural identity. Okay, so what is the solution? What we learned from being in the field in Maseno is that you must think about governance before the data set is created. You must speak to the community. And here you have to build relationships. You must explain your purpose. You must negotiate terms and design governance together. Some of the conversations when we're discussing a benefit is that people said, oh, we want the benefit to be access to a scholarship for a PhD. And we said, now, how is that benefiting the whole community? Because you go and do your PhD, will you come back to Maseno? Maseno is 30 minutes outside of Kisumu, for those of you who don't know where Maseno is. And so the community had to negotiate within itself and say, okay, we need something that would benefit the whole of the community. But to get there, we had to build relationships. We had to explain to them what licensing is. We had to explain to them what an open license would do and what Noodle would do. We also had to dispel the myth that a lot of the AI developers have, that a one-size-fits-all solution is what would work for them. The Creative Commons is a one-size-fits-all, right? You pick a particular license in the suite of Creative Commons, you slap it on your data set, and it moves. You don't have to have a conversation with anybody. And in some contexts, it makes sense. And I say that as a board member of the Creative Commons. But in language, in African language, it doesn't make sense. Because the community has not been involved in that negotiation, and the license itself did not contemplate use in an African language data set. So we had to ask ourselves, what would make sense for the community? And what were the legitimate concerns that they had? Once you embed communities in decision-making, It produces better data and more defensible governance. People now want to share more, they want to infuse that data set with more, and they believe more that they're not being stripped of something. And finally, we did align it with national and continental frameworks, because these create the policy space, but at the community level, governance fills the space with meaning and accountability. Lelapa, that beautiful picture of Lelapa is there because Lelapa also has their own way of coming up with their license. So they heard about Noodle, and they decided not to use Noodle, but to use something else, which they developed called the Ishwetu license, that was inspired by Noodle. The Ishwetu license is more protectionist than Noodle is. They said, great job with Noodle, but actually we only want to share with Africa, not any other developing country. But that is their right as a community to decide. Okay. So, the path forward from policy to practice. This is the call to action. Noodle is already being adopted, as I've already mentioned, but it needs to expand beyond the natural language processing realm into health data, agricultural data, climate data, cultural heritage. There's somebody who is thinking about using it in climate data, but they're still figuring out how to do that. What are we trying to do? We're trying to build a licensing ecosystem and not just a single instrument. But Noodle is also on version 1. Usually version 1 has lots of mistakes and some panel beating to be done. And that will happen as we scale. We need to bridge policy and practice. National strategies, policies are excellent, but they must explicitly incorporate community governance mechanisms. And a lot of this is not just public participation, and not public participation in the flavor of how it's done today. It is meaningful engagement with people whose data is comprised in the data set. Governance rights are meaningless without the capacity to exercise them. That's why we went to Maseno and spoke to the community and taught the community how to understand what licenses are. This is also what we must do as people who are preaching the gospel of data governance. Communities need resources, training, legal support, access to information. And this is a dedicated investment from governments, development partners, and the private sector. And finally, we need to build coalitions across borders. The Donam Noodle model can be replicated across borders, especially across East Africa and even in Africa. I've shown you an example in South Africa. It would be great to have an example from Tanzania. But we need solidarity and collaboration amongst ourselves. And it also calls for convenings such as this conference, where we can exchange ideas and see. Finally, this is the way that Africa is taking space within the AI development race. We are not mimicking others, but we are centering our people whose lives and languages are the foundation of the data economy. This is what before the data set means. It means that governance starts with the people, with community, with culture. And we are leading the way. We are not copying a particular act or a particular regulatory approach, but we are building and governing according to what makes sense in the African context. what reflects our values, our realities, but most of all, what gives us agency. I'd like to thank you for listening to that. I hope it was not too technical. I'd also like to thank the conference organizers, that is the Open Institute team and the Amnesty Kenya team, for inviting me to Keynote again, and for giving us the space to caucus and collaborate together. CIPIT has a breakout session on governance in practice, building integrated, sovereign, and accountable data and AI systems in Africa this afternoon. Please do attend that session for further discussions. And the Nudu license, the Dhonam dataset, the Mozilla Data Collective, and our analysis of continental frameworks and strategies are all publicly available on our website. I've put some references here for you because at the end of the day, I am truly an academic and I have to reference things. But essentially what I'm asking you to do is to think about data as a representative of individuals, of people, of your community members, as we think about governance. Thank you.